In 1791, a nation shared a vision: freedom from oppression, from slavery, from abuse. The result was one of the only slave rebellions in history that led to founding of a state free from slavery. The revolution in Haiti was the largest slave revolt since Spartacus, almost 2,000 years earlier. To understand why Haiti rose its standard, we'll look at the events that led to it, what was the catalyst, and how its effect was felt around the world. Haiti, or land of high mountains, in the years before the revolution, was a contradiction. The wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, if not the New World. Spectacular profits were built on the backs of enslaved labour. The demand for sugar, coffee, cocoa and indigo in Europe driving these colonies. The island of Hispaniola, or Española, when Columbus named it, had a French colony in the west named Saint-Domingue, roughly modern-day Haiti, and Santo-Domingo, Dominican Republic, in the east. French engineers had created irrigation systems that meant Saint-Domingue and Jamaica were world leaders in sugar production. Conditions were brutal and violent. Diseases such as malaria and yellow fever claimed many of those arriving without prior immunity. 20,000 slaves being transported in 1798, contrasted against 38,000 for the whole of the British West Indies, which was thousands of islands, cays and islets. The mortality rate from yellow fever was around 50% within a year of arriving on the island, meaning that plantation owners chose to work slaves hard with a minimum food or shelter, calculating they were probably going to pass away anyway. Knowledge of this mortality rate for those arriving without immunity also angered foreign soldiers that were posted there. More on this later. Having no legal rights, abuses and essays against slaves were widespread, with French slave masters extremely ruthless in their treatment of slaves, even by Caribbean standards. The threat of, or the act of violence was used to maintain control and suppress the possibility of rebellion. Slaves that tried to escape or disobeyed were whipped, or more severe punishments, such as castration or burning. Regulations from mainland France meant to regulate violence and treatment of slaves in general were openly and consistently broken by masters. Some decades before the revolution, planters had passed legislation that propagated a rigid caste system. White colonialists further divided into plantation owners, then a lower class that were overseers, labourers, shop owners and artisans. The second class were free people of colour, usually mixed race, sub-Saharan African and European descent. They were normally educated and literate, men working as administrators in plantations or soldiers. Some of these owned and operated plantations, becoming slave owners themselves. The third class, outnumbering the others by a ratio of 10 to 1, were mainly African-born slaves. The mortality rate requiring new imports ensured that the culture remained more African, helping to create a religion that combined Catholicism and West African religions, known as Voodoo, a belief system implicitly rejecting the African status as slaves. This served as a distinction between African arrivals and Creoles, slaves born on the island, who often held more important roles on plantations, had family structures, and normally had more chance of gaining freedom. Saint-Domingue was rich, but built on terror and imbalance. This was a society seething with hatred, with white colonists and black slaves frequently coming into violent conflict. Haiti was hell, but Haiti was rich. Most conflicts arose from escaping slaves. Many of these, referred to as maroons, lived on the periphery of plantations, living off the land and stealing what they could. They also moved to towns, blending in with local slaves, and freed blacks. The larger groups of runaway slaves who lived in the hillside woods away from white control often conducted raids on the island's sugar and coffee plantations. Although the numbers in these bands grew large, they generally lacked the leadership and strategy to accomplish large-scale objectives. The first effective maroon leader to emerge was the charismatic Haitian voodoo priest, Francois Macandal, who inspired his people by drawing on African traditions and religions. He united the maroon bands and established a network of secret organizations amongst plantation slaves, leading a rebellion from 1751 through 1757. Although Macandal was captured by the French and burned at the stake in 1758, large armed maroon bands persisted in raids and harassment after his death. One of the main planks building towards rebellion was ironically the French Revolution of 1799. After the First Republic was formed, the National Assembly published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Note the eye of providence at the top. Previous Enlightenment thought had not accounted for or covered the existence of slavery within European society and incompatibility. This declaration also didn't make it clear as to whether women, slaves, and citizens of the colonies were covered under this. Increasing calls for clarity and equality echoed the earlier ones. Influenced in part by Enlightenment ideas, Toussaint Louverture would later emerge as one of the leading generals of the Haitian Revolution. But he did not simply imitate European thought. He applied it to the brutal realities of Saint-Domingue and to the knowledge gained by black people under slavery and colonial rule. In doing so, he confronted a contradiction many Enlightenment thinkers had left unresolved: how a society claiming liberty could still tolerate slavery. He would later write a constitution for Saint-Domingue that abolished slavery altogether, marking him out as one of the revolution's most important figures. Since the 1780s, Julien Raymond, a plantation owner and free man of colour, had been appealing to France for full equality for men of colour. Owning 100 slaves, he was one of the richest men in his racial class. Moving to France in 1785, he was well placed to make this a main colonial issue to the National Assembly. Another tipping point on the road to rebellion was Victor Hugo, another wealthy free man of colour's drive to achieve the right to vote under the declaration above. When the governor refused to grant this request in October 1790, he led an insurrection in the area of Le Cap-François, a port in the northern region of the island, with a large proportion of freed people of colour. Captured a few months later, he was brutally executed by being broken on the wheel. This was one of the reasons slave rebels gave for the uprising in August 1791 happening. Another was white planters' wish to seek independence from France after the declaration. Resenting limits on trade from the mainland, they sought to break free in order to increase wealth and power. Africans on the island began to hear these rumours, and fearing harsher treatment than the current treatment, mostly aligned against the planters, preferring the royalist and British elements. Till now, the battle had been between factions of whites and whites versus people of colour, with enslaved blacks viewing from afar. This was about to change. The French government moved to grant wealthy free people of colour citizenship in May 1791. White planters refused to comply, leading to violence between free people of colour and whites, increasing the tension. Watching on, enslaved blacks, resentful of both groups for continuing their bondage, started to plot rebellion and revenge. This occurred on the 21st of August 1791. Thousands of slaves had been attending a secret voodoo event when thunder and lightning started. Taking this as auspicious signs, the slaves later that night started to kill their masters. This is how unrest became open revolt. 10 days later, the slaves had led an unprecedented revolt, capturing the northern province. Whites kept control of only a few isolated, fortified camps. Historians Lynn Hunt and Jack R. Sensor described the violence as involving, quote, pillage, rape, torture, mutilation, and death, end quote. The years of oppression and subjugation had left many blacks with a hatred of all whites, with the campaign being conducted with extreme violence. As Perry writes, masters and mistresses were dragged from their beds and killed, and the heads of French children were placed on pikes carried before the rebel columns. Sparking revolt in the south, 13,000 rebels and slaves burned plantations, occupied and then burnt the two major cities, Léogâne and Jacmel. In 1791, the revolt in the north grew with extraordinary speed, drawing in around 100,000 enslaved people within weeks and devastating plantations across the colony. As the uprising spread, Thousands of whites were killed, and hundreds of sugar, coffee, and indigo plantations were burnt or destroyed, before white militias retaliated with mass killings of black people. At this stage, the rebels were not yet fighting for independence from France, but for freedom and the rights they believed had been granted by the French. By 1792, the rebellion had become so serious that the French National Assembly granted rights to free men of colour, sent troops to the island, and moved towards abolishing slavery in parts of the colony. This shocked European states and the United States. However, the National Assembly was determined to quell the revolt. What began as rebellion was now hardening into revolution. In 1793, as revolutionary France went to war with Britain, leading white colonists in Saint-Domingue turned to the British for help against the French commissioners, hoping to preserve slavery and the old colonial order. Britain and Spain both entered the struggle, backing anti-French forces and supplying food, ammunition, arms, medicine, naval support, and military advisors. But although the British quickly gained footholds on the island, their campaign was crippled by the devastating effects of yellow fever on non-immune troops, especially young and inexperienced reinforcements from Europe. Among the troops, the island soon gained a grim reputation as a feared and deeply unwelcome posting, with disease cutting men down far more effectively than the enemy. What had begun as a slave rebellion was now being pulled into a far larger struggle. With revolutionary France at war, and Britain and Spain intervening for their own ends, Saint-Domingue was no longer facing a local uprising alone. Rebellion had become revolution, because the fight was now not over just slavery, but who would rule the colony, and what kind of society would emerge from its ruins. As Saint-Domingue descended into a struggle of slave revolt, civil conflict, foreign invasion, and imperial rivalry, Toussaint began to emerge as the one figure capable of mastering the chaos. He rose not simply because he could fight, but because he combined military ability with political intelligence, understanding that survival would depend on backing the side most likely to preserve emancipation. When revolutionary France abolished slavery, he cast aside his Spanish allies and aligned himself with the French Republic, a cold but decisive move that helped make him the colony's leading general. But Toussaint aimed at more than victory. He tried to rebuild Saint-Domingue, restore production, and impose order while keeping slavery abolished, creating a regime that was powerful, disciplined, and deeply uneasy in its contradictions. This was a source of both his greatness and his weakness. Toussaint had preserved freedom and brought a measure of stability to a colony shattered by war. Yet he had done so by concentrating power in his own hands, and by governing with firmness rather than equality. The stronger he became, the less he looked like a servant of France, and the more he looked like the ruler in all but name. In that sense, his rise solved one problem while creating the next. If Toussaint could build an emancipated colony under his own authority, how long would France tolerate it? Napoleon did not move against Saint-Domingue simply because Louverture had become too powerful, though that was part of it. He moved because Toussaint had created something far more dangerous than the rebellious colony. A black-led regime in France's richest colony, with slavery abolished, order partially restored, and authority slipping out of French hands. Toussaint still claimed loyalty to France, but his constitution, his army, and his control of the island made that loyalty look increasingly hollow. To Napoleon, this was not a colony being governed in France's name, but a colony being kept by a man who had grown too strong to command and too useful to ignore. Behind that lay an even deeper fear. If Saint-Domingue survived on these terms, then emancipation would cease to be an emergency concession and become a political fact, one that threatened not just French authority, but the whole plantation order of the Atlantic world. Napoleon did not come to reconcile with the revolution in Saint-Domingue. He came to master, break it, and if necessary, reverse it. Among Toussaint's commanders, one figure was already beginning to stand out: Jean-Jacques Dessalines. If Toussaint seemed to embody discipline, calculation, and the hope that freedom might yet be secured within some political settlement, Dessalines appeared cut from harsher cloth, a formidable fighter, but one whose talent seemed better suited to a war with no real prospect of compromise. That distinction would become crucial once France made clear what it intended. The war became a fight for independence when France destroyed the last grounds for trust. Toussaint had tried to preserve emancipation while still operating, at least formally, within the French world. But France answered with deceit, arrest, deportation, and his death in prison. That mattered far beyond one man. It showed that even the most powerful black leader in Saint-Domingue could be neutralized once he trusted French promises, and it helped destroy the idea that freedom could be secured under French rule. Once that illusion died, the struggle changed its character. It was no longer about preserving emancipation within empire, but about making sure France could never return with the power to reverse it. Yet the victory helped secure carried its own bitter contradiction. Dessalines made independence real and helped ensure that slavery would not simply be reimposed under French rule. But the order he built rested on force, hierarchy, and coercive labour discipline. The plantations were not restored as before, but many Haitians still found themselves under a hard, militarised system that treated freedom as something to be controlled from above. So the new Haiti was both a world historic break and a grim irony. Born from revolution, yet governed in ways that showed how much of the old habit of compulsion had survived. What independence changed was immense. In 1804, Haiti destroyed French rule, made emancipation permanent, and created the first black state born from a successful slave revolution. In Haitian political thought, independence and abolition were inseparable. The point was not simply to expel France, but to make re-enslavement impossible. That gave the revolution a world historic meaning. Haiti was not just another colony breaking away. It was a state founded by people who had been enslaved, and who had forced one of the richest slave colonies in the world out of the imperial system altogether. But what independence did not change is just as important. It did not bring peace, prosperity, or an easy liberal order. The war had wrecked plantations and towns, left much of the population destitute, and created a severe shortage of administrators, planners, and skilled workers. Nor did victory remove the pressure to produce. Dessalines continued coercive plantation labour policies because Haiti's rulers feared economic collapse, foreign reconquest, and the complete disintegration of authority. Slavery had been destroyed, but compulsion had not. The revolution ended ownership of people, not the belief that labour had to be disciplined from above. Nor was Haiti allowed to enter the world on equal terms. Many outside powers ostracized it, because a successful slave revolution terrified every slaveholding society in the Atlantic. The United States under Jefferson refused to recognize Haitian independence, and France did not recognize it until 1825, when it did so only by extracting a massive indemnity. So the new country was born not only from victory, but into siege, suspicion, and punishment. Haiti had won sovereignty, but not acceptance, freedom, but not security, independence, but not relief from the economic and racial order of the wider world. The signal did spread across the world though. Simon Bolivar, a well-known revolutionary, received arms and help from Haiti, and publicly credited Haiti with part of the success. Haiti had done the impossible. It had overthrown slavery, defeated empire, and declared itself free. But the country born in 1804 inherited a harsher truth as well: that victory could secure independence, yet not spare a new nation from devastation, coercion, and a hostile world. Everyone out there that's striving for something, keep on along that road. Best of luck to you.